after a major offshore discovery in 2015, a tiny country that you may not have even heard of is projected by some to be the world's leading oil producer within just a few years. Will this little country be able to handle its big oil? Hello and welcome to this very special, very first episode of the Modern Context podcast. I'm your host, Yasmin Aliyah Khan, and I am so excited to be here with you. This podcast was a long time coming, and I really hope that you enjoy it. I, along with several other people, worked really hard to put it together, and there's a lot of me in this podcast. So since this is the inaugural episode, here is what you can expect going forward. At the top of each episode, we will catch up on some recent news affecting us here in the US and abroad, and afterwards, we'll take some time to dive a little deeper into our main story. The whole point of this podcast is, you guessed it, context. I'm big on it. I believe in context. I think in this modern world where everything is so fast and so dopamine driven and so attention hungry, we've really got to slow down sometimes. Stories that often get covered in the news really don't get covered in as much detail as would be required for the average viewer to really get an understanding on what's going on in these places and with these stories. And it's not the news's fault, they do what they can with the time that they're given. But a lot of people also get their news from TikToks and Instagram threads. There's even less time for context there. They really just allow for gut reactions, and they deliberately cultivate heightened emotions. But contemplation or the exploration of ideas, not so much. So my goal with this podcast is to get you started somewhere. Take what you learn here and go forth. If I say something that sounds interesting or concerning or puzzling, read up on it more. We're here to understand and to learn. And maybe most importantly, I'm not here to sway you from one side of things to the other. In fact, I think you'll find that most of the stories that we cover here don't have two very well-defined sides to take anyway. Now, you probably will be able to tell how I feel about something. I'm not going to go out of my way to hide it, but my feelings aren't the story. I'll do my best to give you the facts, and yes, I'll give you my take on them, but you may feel differently from me, and that's okay. For this first episode, I did say it was special. It is going to be a little different from the other episodes in terms of format, but it's special because this one is actually a little bit personal for me. I mentioned in the intro that you may not have even heard about this country that we're going to be discussing today, and I didn't say that to insult anyone's intelligence, but I say that because for my entire life, up until just a few years ago, when I would tell people that my family is from Guyana, they would inevitably, almost every time, ask me, "Where is that?" And honestly, I kind of liked it that way. I'm a very protective person over the things and the people and the places that I love. And that really comes from a strong place of conservation and preservation. And let's be honest, the minute that people, specifically Americans, get hip to something, they tend to exploit it. It's like when a vegetable becomes trendy, which is already weird, but then next thing you know, every restaurant you go to is serving pasta with squash blossoms. Don't need it. Well, now the whole world is hip to Guyana, a small country on the northern Atlantic coast of South America, bordered by two countries that everyone has heard of, Brazil and Venezuela, as well as Suriname. In 2015, large oil reserves were discovered in Guyana, reserves so large that they could dramatically alter life in Guyana, its infrastructure, its economy, its government, everything. And to be fair, Guyana could use a boon. With a population of not even 1 million people, Guyana had one of the lowest GDPs per capita in all of South America up until the oil was discovered. And now it's projected to become the fastest growing economy in the world by the end of this year, as well as the wealthiest country in South America and the world's largest oil producing country. Over the past 3 years alone, the Guyanese economy has tripled. But as is always the case whenever resources are found in a small nation, challenges abound. For one, the country currently lacks the infrastructure that would be necessary to sustain such rapid growth as what's being projected. For another, everyone, predictably, wants a piece of this oil wealth, including both the US and China. Guyana also has a history of political instability, some of that due to foreign intervention, as well as government corruption. And then, inevitably, there's the challenge of climate change. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's back up a little bit and get a better understanding of this very small but suddenly significant country. Guyana is a former British colony that sits on the Guyana Highlands, along with Suriname, which used to be Dutch Guyana, and French Guyana, which is still French Guyana. These three countries are the only non-Spanish, non-Portuguese speaking countries in South America, and Guyana is the only country in South America in which English is the official language. As such, whenever you see a map that's specifically depicting Latin America, you might actually notice that those three countries in the corner there, they're actually blacked out. Guyana sits just north of the equator and it has a tropical climate. The majority of its population lives along the coastal plain because the interior of the country is mostly jungle. Guyana is known as the land of many waters and it has numerous rivers running through it. It also has one of the largest single-drop waterfalls in the world when measuring for height and volume, Kaicher Falls. And Guyana really takes a lot of pride in its history of preserving its rainforests and its rivers, living with the land rather than in opposition to it. Now, prior to this oil discovery, the nation's biggest industries included gold, bauxite, rice, and sugar. In fact, you may actually be familiar with Demerara sugar. Or if not that, then maybe Demerara rum. Rum is a big deal in Guyana. Now, here is why I hate being asked the question, so where are you from? For the record, I was born in Connecticut, I'm an American, but explaining my family's cultural background, that is more of a challenge. As I mentioned, Guyana is a former British colony, so when they needed workers to work the tobacco and the sugarcane fields, they imported slaves from West Africa. When the British Empire outlawed slavery, they had to come up with something else. So they tapped into their imperialistic resources and they started importing indentured servants, most of whom came from northern India. Those were my ancestors. Today, Indians make up the majority population in Guyana, with Black people making up the second largest ethnic group. The rest of the population is comprised of indigenous people, Portuguese, Chinese, and European white people. And thanks to the British, the official language is, as I mentioned, English. Culturally, Guyana is pretty interesting, rife with intersectionality. For example, it's geographically located in South America, but it's not considered a part of Latin America. Instead, it's considered Caribbean or a part of the West Indies because of its strong cultural and historic ties to that region. It's even the headquarters for CARICOM, which is an alliance of Caribbean countries. However, it's also a part of the Union of South American Nations. Beyond that, it's home to several different diaspora communities. And there's a good mix of cultures and religions in this one country. There are significant Christian and Hindu and Muslim populations there, but beyond that, people's cultural roots are still present within the Guyanese culture. So for me, I'm Indian. I look Indian, I present as Indian, but I don't actually have as much in common with Indian or Pakistani people as people might think just from looking at me. That said, as an Indo-Guyanese, we still eat curry and roti and dal. It just might taste a little different than what you would get at an Indian restaurant. We wear traditional Indian clothing for holidays and celebrations and weddings. We watch Bollywood films, but we have to watch them with subtitles because we don't speak the language anymore, so you get it. So you combine all these different elements with staples of Caribbean culture that I'm sure you're already familiar with, and you get my parents, English-speaking Indian people from South America. My family immigrated to New York City in the 1960s and 70s because things in Guyana at the time were not great. Let's talk about why. So I won't go too terribly far back in the history as I'm sometimes known to do, but I will start you off in the 1830s. At this time, the country was recently dubbed British Guyana after the Dutch ceded their colonies to Britain, the British had outlawed slavery, and the first Indians arrived in Guyana in 1838. The Indian population stuck primarily to the country, and after slavery was outlawed, the majority of the black population moved into the more urban areas, essentially creating a new working class. Now, by the end of the century, Venezuela was challenging the Treaty of Munster, which was a part of the Treaty of Westphalia that required Spain to acknowledge Dutch land possessions abroad. This included Guyana. Now, Venezuela claimed that the treaty only acknowledged land east of the Essequibo River, meaning that nearly 2/3 of British Guyana was supposed to be their land. So, a panel of 2 Americans, 1 Russian, and 2 British people sat down to decide who would get to keep the land west of the Essequibo River, Venezuela or Britain. Again, there's 2 British people on this panel. This is supposed to be a neutral panel, but they did rule in 1899 that all of the land would get to stay as part of British Guyana. And this is all relevant because these land claims have been reignited ever since oil was discovered in Guyanese territory nearly 2 centuries later. So following World War I, some of the Afro-Guyanese had actually fought in the war for the British. So whenever they returned back to Guyana, they had a little bit more influence over local politics. They also made up the majority of the electorate, even though they did not make up the majority of the population. This was arguably the beginning of what would go on to be a significant racial divide within the country that still exists today. Now, at first, the British attempted to tamp down that Afro-Guyanese political influence, but that didn't go over so well. So, by the 1950s, after World War II, Guyana saw a few things: universal suffrage, an expanded electorate, a bicameral legislature, and democratic elections. Entered Chetty Jagan. Chetty Jagan was Indian. He was educated in the United States, and he was a Marxist. In 1947, he was elected to the Guyanese Legislative Council, and in 1950, he founded the People's Progressive Party, or the PPP, one of Guyana's 2 major political parties that are still active today. In 1953, Chetty Jagan was elected prime minister in the country's first election since universal suffrage became a thing. Unfortunately, the British didn't like him because they feared he was a communist. Specifically, he was an anti-colonialist who was keen on passing a labor relations bill which would have ensured workers' protections and union rights. So, they jailed him and his ministers. Guyana then endured 7 years of British occupation, at which point they held another election. And Chetty Jagan won again. But backing up just a bit, during those 7 years of British occupation, a few things had happened. For one, the PPP had split. One of the party's founders, Forbes Burnham, an Afro-Guyanese who was also a bit of a Marxist, created the People's National Congress, or the PNC, modern-day Guyana's other major political party. Now, at the time, the Pan-African movement was gaining momentum and popularity among Black populations across the Caribbean, so Burnham took up that mantle in Guyana. Also, Jagan's labor bill was seen to disproportionately favor the sugar and rice workers, most of whom were Indian. Largely because of this, as well as other economic and cultural differences between the 2 groups, the country's political parties became racially delineated. In 1959, Cuba saw Castro's revolution and a rise in communism, a problem that would go on to be a problem for the U.S., and the following year, John F. Kennedy was elected president of the United States. In 1960, Guyana also saw the formation of the United Force Party, which was a smaller and more conservative party that was primarily comprised of Guyana's Portuguese population. Now, by the time Jagan was re-elected in 1961, the new POTUS was a little on edge regarding communism, what with Cuba and Russia and the Second Red Scare and all. So seeing a self-proclaimed Marxist in Guyana wasn't very comforting. JFK wanted to get ahead of any future problems for himself, so he, along with the CIA, decided that Forbes Burnham was going to be the next prime minister instead. The plan was to destabilize the country and delegitimize Jagan's government by way of race-related riots and protests in an effort to remove Jagan from office for a second time, all of which was funded by the US government. Then, in a move that we are all too familiar with here in the States, they fudged the numbers. The Indo-Guyanese population was still the majority in Guyana, so the British basically redistricted the nation and implemented a more proportional way of counting votes that put the Indian population at a disadvantage. The PNC, which was now allied with the United Force Party, could then form a coalition and win an election. So another election was held in 1963, and the PPP actually won again, but with the new counting rules, they didn't win by enough. And so Forbes Burnham, the CIA-backed leader of the PNC, was made Prime Minister of Guyana, finally. And unfortunately for JFK, Burnham turned out to be the Marxist nightmare that he thought Jagan was going to be. In 1966, Guyana earned its independence from Britain, and by the 1970s, Burnham had declared Guyana to be a Marxist cooperative republic. He became more authoritarian, he nationalized industries, and he consolidated power, changing Guyana's bicameral legislation to a unicameral one and sitting himself up at the top of it, rigging elections and keeping himself in power. He also got quite chummy with Castro over in Cuba, and political opposition leaders found themselves dead. And during his time in office, Guyana's debt grew and grew to the point that they had to approach the IMF and ask for help, and economic growth during this time was very, very slow. It was during these years that Guyana saw an exodus of its people, including my parents and grandparents, to places like the US, Canada, and England. And with all of the election rigging and the power consolidating and the fleeing electorate, the Guyanese people couldn't seem to get rid of Burnham until he died in 1985 in Cuba. And 3 years later, in 1988, I was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, part of the first generation of Americans for my bloodline. In 1992, Guyana held its first free and fair election since Burnham, and you will never guess who won. Cheddi Jagan, back at it again 30 years later. The PPP would go on to win every major election in Guyana since the 1990s, with one notable exception. In 2015, David Granger of the PNC was elected president, and you'll also remember what else happened in 2015. Oil was discovered in Guyana. Granger would hold his office until 2020-ish, sort of. So during his time in office, he was responsible for overseeing Guyana's historic transition from economically impoverished nation to liquid gold mine. The PPP took back control in 2020 with Irfan Ali as president and former President Bharat Jagdeo serving as vice president. Now, going forward, Guyana really has its work cut out for it. It will not only have to contend with the world's eyes and the world's greed, but it already had its own set of challenges going into all of this. One of the first things that I thought of when I first heard that oil was discovered in Guyana was the curse of natural resources. We've seen entire continents and subcontinents plundered and pillaged throughout history by external forces. And it's the reason why Wakanda literally built a vibranium bubble around themselves to hide its abundance from the rest of the world. And they were right to do so, because look at what happened the minute their secret was discovered. I only saw the first Black Panther, so if there's more to that story, I don't know what it is. But oil is a hell of a secret to keep from the world, especially if you're hoping to make some money off of it. Since the oil was discovered, Guyana has been courting support from across the globe, including both the US and China. Of course, both of those nations are hoping to share in Guyana's promised prosperity, but a lot of the intervention we're seeing is closely linked with the country's infrastructure. In order to build and grow and sustain a major industry like oil, a country needs to have the infrastructure in place to support it. Guyana decidedly does not, and it's getting a little desperate. It's already supplying Europe with nearly half of its oil since the world started looking for alternatives to Russian oil last year. And during the first year of the pandemic, Guyana saw economic growth at a rate of approximately 44% compared to just 5% the year before. By the end of this year, it's expected to be the world's fastest growing economy. Rystad Energy estimates that the government could see $1 billion in oil revenues this year alone. Growth at such rapid rates needs to be supported and properly managed. So, one thing that Granger did do as president before he was removed from office was set up a natural resources fund at the New York Federal Reserve. All of Guyana's oil money is set to go straight into that fund, and the funds are to be made available to the Guyanese government progressively over time. But while he did do that, Granger didn't want to go into debt against future oil sales. So instead of spending money up front to get some infrastructure projects going, he didn't. And the result was approximately 7,000 Indo-Guyanese workers lost their jobs when their places of business were forced to close due to lack of funding for repairs and maintenance. Granger was ultimately removed from office because of this and a few other reasons, losing a vote of no confidence, which made way for the current PPP government. So going forward, ExxonMobil is currently building a pipeline and natural gas cycle plant in Guyana, and as a part of its controversial Belt and Road Initiative, China was awarded a commission to build a hydroelectric power plant, which itself was controversial for reasons we'll get into later, but they recently pulled out of the project. Still, the country maintains close relations with both the Americans and the Chinese, and Chinese workers have been given logging and mining rights within the country. Also, Hess Corporation is in Guyana working to build up the country's healthcare system. So naturally, you've got to worry that this small country with a somewhat unstable government might be taken advantage of. We've already seen countries throughout, Africa, Asia, South and Central America fall into debt traps with China and the US via the World Bank and the IMF. And we here in the States know all too well that these oil and gas companies are no joke. They're not to be messed with. They're practically untouchable in how much power and authority they wield on the world's political and economic stage. Guyana already has a reputation for corruption within government, and that's under both the PNC and the PPP. Recently, actually, an investigative journalist working for Vice uncovered ongoing corruption between Chinese workers and the vice president Jagdeo. Jagdeo denied the allegations, and when he was confronted with them, he got quite noticeably upset and very defensive. But despite his denials, the report caught some pretty damning evidence on tape. However, if the country hopes to maintain control over its own resources in a way that ensures that its own Guyanese people are the ones benefiting the most from them, they've got to be proactive, and it seems like they're at least making efforts to do so. For example, corporations like ExxonMobil are required to pay corporate taxes, higher royalties, and signing bonuses for drilling and operating within the country, so that's a good start. It's also working to maintain a diversified economy, not putting all of its eggs into the oil basket, even though the oil basket is comically larger than all of the other baskets combined. And Guyanese leadership is thinking ahead, planning to invest its new wealth into the nation's education, healthcare services, and highway system. Now, maybe it's the Texan in me, but the phrase developing the highway system is a little triggering. We here in Houston, as I'm sure is the case in many major cities around the world, are used to never-ending highway construction as a way of life, with the promise of just one more lane repeatedly failing to deliver on its promise to reduce traffic congestion and make everyone's life easier, but only after 5 years of construction that makes that same traffic congestion that it was supposed to fix so much worse in the meantime. And then it doesn't even fix anything. Traffic is still terrible, and all we've managed to do is embolden and ensure our ongoing dependency on the fossil fuel industry, pave over our green spaces, cut down our trees, and gray wash our skies. I mean, I can do a whole podcast episode on this topic alone. If you can't tell, I'm a little worked up over it. But with the world at least now pretending to care about the environment, some cities are looking back to take back some of the land that they lost to pavement, undoing some of the car infrastructure in an effort to rely less on cars and more on modes of public transportation. Guyana, however, is going in the opposite direction. And to be fair, its current road and highway infrastructure is nowhere near what you would find in most major cities or developed countries, so it could probably afford a few more of them. But currently, Guyana is what you call a carbon sink, meaning that it takes in more carbon than it puts out into the atmosphere thanks to strong conservation and protective measures regarding its rivers and rainforest. But now, with more logging and mining access being granted to foreigners, specifically the Chinese, and with large infrastructure projects underway, the land is being transformed both on the coast and in the interior. Now, the indigenous populations that exist primarily in the jungle want greater land rights because, as it stands now, they can't do a whole lot when they see people digging up the land and cutting down the trees. And a lot of these projects would directly affect them and their way of life. Take the hydroelectric plant that's planned for the interior. The indigenous population that lives in the area is concerned that it will threaten the land's biodiversity, flooding large swaths of land and resulting in the death of native plants and wildlife. They already had a dam disaster in 2021. It becomes a question of how high of a price is too high. On the surface, a hydroelectric plant sounds like a great, sustainable, green form of energy, and it's nice to see from a country that now is literally fueling the rest of the globe's dependency on oil. But even green energy comes at a cost. Now, Guyanese environmental lawyer Melinda Janke, along with Ronald Birch Smith, the current president of the Bar Association of Guyana, is suing the Guyanese government and ExxonMobil for the damage being done to Guyana's lands and waters. The 11-barrel discovery of oil by ExxonMobil flipped Guyana from a carbon sink to a carbon bomb, and one of the most formidable ones in the world. This means that Guyana is now capable of releasing more than a gigaton of carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere. The lawsuit alleges that ExxonMobil and the Guyanese government is overdeveloping the land, which is a really nice way of saying they're destroying the land, contributing to the acidification of the waters, and contributing to the climate change that we're all supposedly trying to curtail. According to Janke, the effects on the Guyanese climate is already evident. Guyana is known for its fish and shrimp, but now you can see more shrimp in the shops that's being imported from places like Vietnam. In response to the lawsuit, the government says that it has the right to develop the land for the betterment of the country and the betterment of the people. And ExxonMobil had the audacity to say that the assertions regarding their impact on climate is a matter of scientific opinion rather than actual fact. Seriously. Janke also says that the World Bank hired lawyers for ExxonMobil to alter Guyana's laws regarding climate transparency and environmental protections on the grounds that the laws were out of date. Furthermore, ExxonMobil is encouraging gas production in Guyana. It's already building that gas cycle plant in the country that we mentioned earlier, and it's currently flaring billions of cubic feet of gas offshore. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for a country like Guyana to ignore the impact of climate change. Historically, Guyana has been safely outside of the path of hurricanes, traveling from West Africa to North America. But due to climate change, specifically warmer ocean temperatures and changes in global wind and current patterns, Guyana might start to see some more tropical weather going forward. Now, of course, that's not great. As would be the case anywhere, this is expected to disturb the natural wildlife, but this could be a problem, for example, in the capital city of Georgetown, which actually sits on the Atlantic coast below sea level. Georgetown is already reliant on a system of dikes and levees to prevent flooding in the city. So any kind of tropical activity along the Guyanese coast could be detrimental to the city. And again, maybe it's the Texan in me, specifically the Houstonian me, that gets a little frustrated by all of this. Houston is the energy capital of the world, and we also sit along the Gulf Coast. If a major hurricane were to hit us just right, which really is more of an inevitability rather than just a possibility these days, it would be a disaster, not just for Houston, but for the whole country, maybe even for the world. And the protections that we have in place against such a disaster are old and crumbling. And funding for the necessary repairs is, for some reason, hard to come by. Why more people aren't talking about this, I don't know, but I'm sure it'll all be fine. Okay, I've got to tell you, I've worked on so many stories like this one, where I talk about different countries and the challenges facing them and how those challenges affect the people, etc. And whenever I do that, I try really, really hard to be respectful of the people and the culture. I always try to keep the people central in my mind when I'm writing and while I'm researching and ultimately as I'm presenting the story, because I don't want to misrepresent them and I don't want to diminish their entire home to a headline. And I always wonder how I would feel if someone did that to my home and to my culture. And full disclosure, Guyana is not my home. I was born in Connecticut, I'm in Texas now, I'm an American. But I've grown up with these incredibly strong ties to a place that I don't know intimately. In many ways, it defines major parts of who I am. I'm protective of the culture and the people. I wasn't raised by just two Guyanese parents. I was raised by an entire community of Guyanese people that stretch all the way from Toronto, Canada, all the way down to Orlando, Florida. There's too many of them to name. And I'm sad about the fact that the culture is less a part of me than it is my parents. And if I ever have kids, Guyana will just be a place to them. Maybe they'll feel similarly to Guyana as I feel about India, and that they understand that it's a part of them, but less a part of them as it would have been had things been different. One thing that I don't think gets talked about often enough is how much colonialism and foreign intervention contributes to things like cultural erasure. It seems an obvious point, but what do they say? If you want to erase a culture, you erase the language. My grandfather, who is now in his early 90s, can kind of understand some Hindi, but he can't speak it. My parents don't speak it or understand any of it, apart from a few words here and there that have made their way into the Guyanese English vernacular. But even that, I think, is pretty great. It shows that our culture, our ancestry, our roots are still present in our culture somewhere. The spices are still in our food. The language is still in the music. It's all still hanging on. There was always a sense of timelessness with a place that no one really knew about. Like it would always be there, preserved, existing within as much of a vacuum as any place can get away with these days, like its own protective vibranium bubble that kept a secret that only a privileged few were in on. But that secret's out now, and in a much bigger way than we've seen in a long time on the world stage, and in a much bigger way than the Guyanese people could probably ever have foreseen or even imagined. And now I'm helping to reveal the secret. I'm a part of it. And I'm a Scorpio. What do they say about Scorpios? We just be keeping secrets for no reason. So this is awkward for me. Honestly, I'll probably regret everything about this episode as soon as I hit publish, but here we are. But seriously, I am excited about this podcast, and as I said at the start, I put a lot of myself into my work. So I thought, what better way to honor this new endeavor and myself and the people who raised me by starting off with something close to my heart. It's also an ode to any other country or culture I've ever covered in the past or will go on to cover in the future. I can't do for them something that I was unwilling to do for my own people. Guyana has its work cut out for it, and as always with cases like this, I genuinely hope for the best for them, but as we've discussed, sometimes what is best is difficult to define. If we know anything, it's that change is inevitable, but the nature and scope of that change, I believe, is largely determined by intention. And I, ever the doubter, am cautiously optimistic that things will work out just fine for Guyana and for its people. And that's a wrap on the very first episode of the Modern Context podcast. I feel good. How do you feel? Next time on Modern Context, we'll dive into some topical and exciting and hopefully interesting news stories. But in the meantime, we would love to hear from you. Reach out to the show at hello@modconpod.com with any suggestions or questions you might have for us. Also, don't forget to follow the show wherever you get your podcasts, and please tell your friends about us. Finally, thank you all so much for listening and for being here with me. I truly, truly appreciate it, and I can't wait to see you next time. Cheers.